Hello, and it's very nice to be here in Kolkata, and thank you for having me here. This is a city, of course, many happy associations for me, because this is the city of my childhood, and I'm very happy to come back here. And actually, my husband always remarks that my mood seems to lift even before I've actually landed in Calcutta. So here I am, and any discourse on free speech in this city is of special significance, because this has really been the nerve center and the hub of art, literature, music, dance, films, and intellectual discourse. The Adda originated in Kolkata. And therefore, I think with its great traditions of free speech, I think it's a matter of great disappointment and that a professor from this city should be taken to task for his irreverent cartoons, or an artist, an authors who perhaps write provocatively, even perhaps offensively, that they should be denied entry into the city. I think Kolkata and the state of West Bengal has been far more robust and broad-shouldered than that. I think we can handle much more than that. I think Kolkatans are made of much firmer stuff. The freedom of speech is ultimately a notion, a very dynamic notion that takes new color and acquires new dimensions with changing times and evolving technologies. And in today's context, the freedom of speech means just a myriad different fascinating things. We continue to have, of course, the traditional classical media, which is, of course, books and newspapers, art forms, cartoons even, films, dance, theatre, music. And we also, of course, have now television, we have the internet and the social media, and we also have the mobile phone, which is now a source of not just a means of communication, but also a source of, information and entertainment. Now, all of these different media, it's very difficult to have a common regulatory framework. And from the censorship standpoint, I think that, all these different media, they have so many different nuances that they cannot be treated all alike. So, for example, when we speak of the internet, I think the damage that something on the net can do is, I think we all know, is incalculably greater than what a book can do, for example. And therefore, it's at a certain level acceptable that the censorship norms would be different for the net. And we've seen, for example, only a few months ago, the young Boston bombers, how they were indoctrinated and how they derived inspiration from the speeches of a Yemeni cleric, Al-Awlaki, if I pronounce that correctly, which they downloaded from the internet. And this man, of course, the cleric, has been dead for some years now, but still draws that kind of awe and inspiration. These young men also learn to make the bomb from the material that they accessed on the net. So, the kind of damage that that medium is capable of is, of course, incalculably greater. And therefore, perhaps, all of these different media are treated a little differently, but underlying each one of them at the end of the day is the common thread is, of course, the freedom of speech and expression under Article 19(1)(a). I think the game changer in the last few years has, of course, been technology. And technology has actually exposed the ordinary private individual who otherwise had no interaction with the public sphere. It suddenly thrust him or her into the public domain. And this is quite interesting, because now free speech is not just important from the media standpoint or from those who are actually actively involved from within the media, but those outside, ordinary people like you and me. Because so much of our daily routines is been, by virtue of technology, is entwined with the exercise of free speech. So whether it's texting each other, or whether it's blogging or tweeting or being on Facebook, all of this is eventually about the exercise of free speech. And technology, by its very nature, makes all of us so much more exposed to the public domain. And for example, I mean, earlier, when we didn't have these technologies, the level of interaction, the ordinary individual was relatively shielded from that public domain. Today, wittingly or unwittingly, we are just thrust out there, and therefore that makes us, in a sense, vulnerable, more exposed for what we say or do not say. And also, in terms of, in a sense, it violates our personal space in a manner that we perhaps don't even recognize. So, for example, if you're just walking in the mall, there may be a CCTV camera capturing you, or a roving mobile phone, and you have photographs being taken. It may be the Aadhaar card which you're required to apply for and disclose all sorts of personal details which may be used and abused in so many different ways which we cannot contemplate at this stage. It may be just simply blogging or being on Facebook. All of this really has important implications for us, because it has suddenly blurred the boundaries between the public and the private. So in other words, what I'm really getting at here is free speech is no longer just a media concern. It's much, much more than ever before the private individual's concern. As I said, technology has been the game changer, and it's interesting to see how the internet has panned out in so many different ways. On the one hand, the obvious, it's been this hugely liberating medium. I think we all recognize that, but I think it's also been, in some ways, a very limiting medium, and I'll explain this paradox. Liberating, of course, because, it's just revolutionized the whole game. And I hope I don't sound like a dinosaur when I say this, but, I think I had already had most of my education by the time the internet came on the scene, and I cannot tell you just how transformational this is for, some of us who grew up without it. The reach, the speed, the access is just phenomenal. It's been absolutely phenomenal. And it's also provided that in the last few years, the alternate space for people to find expression. People who are not influential enough to, say, get their articles published in the Times of India or in leading newspapers, they suddenly have an option, somewhere to find expression. And in that sense, it's been a great democratizer of free speech. And I think in the aftermath of media scandals such as the Radia tapes expose or paid news, I think there's been a huge trust deficit in the mainstream media, and this has really thrown up the need for an alternative space, and I think the social media has lent voice to that. The third is, of course, we've seen how the Arab Spring was catalyzed perhaps by the social media. So that's, of course, been the very liberating impact of the internet. But there's been another side to it, which is, as I said, the limiting, inhibiting side. Let me explain this. No matter how globalized the world is, ultimately there are certain fundamental value systems which are unlikely to converge, no matter how much the world has shrunk. And ultimately, we must allow for every nation, every society, every people to choose for themselves, to determine for themselves the core values which will underlie their constitution. And it's nobody else's business, I suppose, to be judgmental about what another society chooses for itself. And so you have, on the one hand, the Western democracies which allow for a much more robust right of free speech, the right perhaps even to offend. In the United States, you have the right to burn the national flag if you want. So you have that on the one hand, and then you have other jurisdictions which do not allow for such a robust right. What happens, the difficulty arises when by virtue of technology, speech which is perfectly permissible and constitutional within one jurisdiction wafts across on the web, wittingly or unwittingly, and finds itself in another jurisdiction where it might not just be, it might not just be proscribed, it may be outrageous, it may be blasphemous, it may be punishable with death. What happens then? And we've seen in the last few years, I think it was 2 years ago, we saw the mindless mayhem and devastation that was caused by a film that went viral on the Holy Prophet on the net. So we've seen the consequences of that. And what does it really, it's the sheer seamlessness of this medium which has rendered us helpless. Helpless in the sense that we do not know who our audience is anymore. That whole notion of a select audience, a limited audience, an intended audience is now a thing of the past. Because the whole world, as it were, has sort of been transformed into one single theatre. And that is really, in some ways, limiting, because what is to happen, for example, to a citizen who says that, look, my constitution gives me the right to offend, or a much more robust right of free speech. Is he entitled to exercise those rights to the fullest, or must he restrict himself? Must he limit himself in deference to the sensibilities of others in other jurisdictions? Or alternatively, does this make a case for barriers to be set up? Does it make a case for some kind of internet regulation? In other words, do we need a form of censorship only to ensure a more robust right of free speech? And this is again a paradox, but it's something to think about. When we talk of censorship, I think my own views, and as we've seen, the media play out in India, as far as the mainstream media is concerned, I think we've had a reasonably free and fiesty media in India. Some would think it's a bit too free, and I think there may be a little bit of truth in it, in the sense that we've had such sliding standards of content, of quality, a lot of which we see in television, on the television or newspapers, that perhaps some people feel that there is a need for some kind of regulation to come in. But by and large, I think, unlike in the past where there was much more direct interference by the government with the rights of the media, I don't think there is that kind of interference anymore. The days of Ramesh Thapar, or cases like Sakal Papers, Bennett Coleman, where there was this confrontation between the government and the media, that is no longer, and of course that reached its absolute low point in Nadir with the emergency of 1975, but I don't see any such confrontation anymore. What we do see, however, is that there are challenges from within. I think the censorship comes sometimes from within the media. For example, you have various forms of censorship, because ultimately any process of news selection involves some form of censorship, self-censorship, in the sense that, how much do we publish the story at all? How much space do we give to it? How much prominence do we give to it? So all of this is a process of censorship at a certain level, and this may be guided by various considerations, political proclivities, social philosophies, or pure commercial reasons. And the disturbing thing is, only last month, we had a former judge of the Supreme Court, who now TDSAT chairman, Justice Alam, and we heard a senior journalist who's originally from Calcutta, Swapan Das Gupta, speak on this subject. And what they said was that today, increasingly, the genuine players, the senior journalists who are gradually getting, squeezed out of the mainstream media. And what you have, these are their words, that you have the mafia, real estate agents, all sorts of commercial interests which are taking over, and that is a serious threat to free speech. Economic censorship is, I think, something to look out for, because that is what creates, the pressures, the commercial pressures which are going to impact free speech in the long run. But I think overall, as far as the mainstream media is concerned, by and large, I think the fact that there is so much multiplicity, there's plurality of whether it's newspapers or TV channels, etc. That is going to be really the best safeguard for free speech. Of course, the threats of censorship is really faced by smaller individuals, whether they're filmmakers or authors, cartoonists, as we've seen, artists. These people are much more vulnerable, and the other disturbing trend that we've seen is, of course, parallel censorship, extra-constitutional censorship, where, say, one group representing or claiming to represent a particular community says that, no, I find this film completely offensive, and therefore, even though it may have been cleared by the censor board, we're going to disrupt screenings, we are going to create a law and order situation, and therefore the state, in fact, this is very, very unfortunate that the state, instead of standing up and saying, look, we will ensure that law and order is not breached, the state seems to become a sort of supine spectator or even a supporter of that kind of parallel censorship, and that is really very, very unfortunate, and there's a whole sort of vote bank politics that plays out behind it. We've seen that with Arakshan, a film that was cleared by the censor board, and we've also seen that more recently with Vishwarupam. So these are, I think, the threats are therefore, I would say, at the the level of not the mainstream media, because the government eventually needs the media. It's important to keep the media for them on their right side. I think since this is a symposium also on privacy, I thought I would just make a few remarks on that. I think Justice Ganguly also touched upon, the privacy as a facet of Article 19(1)(a). But I mentioned at the beginning this sort of exposure of the private individual unwittingly perhaps into the public domain by virtue of technology. And I'm going to make a mention of one case which really shows how nuanced a right to privacy is. That's a case from the United Kingdom. It originated in the United Kingdom. It's called Peck versus the United Kingdom. And some of you may have read about it. It's, of course, 2003 judgment. But just for those who don't know, I will recount the facts very quickly. This was about a man who was undergoing severe depression. And he decided to commit suicide by slashing his wrists on a public street outside his own home. And while he was doing this, there was a CCTV camera which captured this, and an alert operator alerted the police, and the police came in and rescued this man, and they were able to save his life. And the local council thought that, they had really scored a point there. And they decided to extol the virtues and the benefits of having CCTV. And so they put this on television for thousands of people to see. And this man, of course, went to court saying that, look, this is a violation of my privacy. And they said that, what are you talking about? You did this on a public street. Where's the privacy? And eventually he lost in the United Kingdom. He had to go to the European Court of Justice, and the European Court held in his favor and said that, look, even though he may have been on a public street outside his home, he was still entitled to privacy, in the sense that his reasonable expectation was that he would have been seen by passers-by, but he did not expect to have been seen by thousands of people on national television. So I think this case tells us that privacy is such a nuanced right. It's not even a spatial concept, in the sense that if I am in the private confines of my home, I am entitled to privacy, and once I step out, I have waived my rights to privacy. That is not the case. So that is interesting from the privacy point of view. And I think, all of us have in some form or the other, we face this challenge that, maybe a photograph on Facebook is put up and there are, suddenly you find yourself so exposed because people may not want to have seen that photograph, have seen it because somebody else has tagged you. Or, for example, I find oftentimes that, when I'm addressing, say, a select audience, I know whom I'm talking to. But once, it's tweeted out, we don't know where it's going. So, this whole notion of an unknown audience, it's an important thing. The other aspect is, of course, privacy is